On the night of November 9th, 1989, a wall that was supposed to last forever began to die, quietly, suddenly, and in full view of the world. Not because an army stormed it, not because bombs shattered it, but because something more powerful than concrete and rifles showed up at the gates. Ordinary people who had finally decided they would rather face the unknown than keep living under fear. And if you're an American watching this story today, you're not just hearing about Germany. You're hearing about the single most important truth of the modern age, one that the United States spent decades defending, paying for, and standing up for when others doubted it. That freedom is not a slogan. Freedom is a force. It pushes. It survives. It outlasts regimes. And when the moment is right, it moves history like a storm. For almost half a century, the Cold War was not merely politics. It was a test of what kind of world human beings would be allowed to live in. Two visions competed for the future, and the Berlin Wall was the clearest evidence of which vision needed violence to survive. The free world, anchored by the United States, was loud, imperfect, constantly arguing, constantly reforming, and still producing something authoritarian systems could never manufacture: opportunity, innovation, and hope that didn't require permission. On the other side was a system that promised equality, but delivered shortages, promised dignity, but delivered surveillance, promised the people, but built governments that feared their own citizens more than any foreign enemy. In Berlin, you could see it in one city, on one street, under one gray sky. West Berlin pulsing with life, East Berlin suffocating behind barriers, watchtowers, and barbed wire. And the most brutal truth of all was this: the wall was not built to keep enemies out. It was built to keep citizens in. That single fact is the moral verdict on the communist project in Europe. The Berlin Wall cut through families like a blade. It separated parents from children, husbands from wives, friends from friends. It turned front doors into dead ends and neighborhoods into forbidden zones. People who tried to cross could be arrested, ruined, or killed. And yet the regime insisted this was protection, a border that defended peace. But if you have to build a prison wall around your own people, what you're protecting is not peace. You're protecting power. You're protecting the right of a small group to control the lives of millions. And for decades, that wall stood as the world's most visible reminder that tyranny does not survive by persuasion. It survives by containment. And through those decades, the United States became more than a country on a map. To millions living behind the Iron Curtain, America became an idea. Sometimes distant, sometimes misunderstood, but impossible to ignore. It was the idea that a human being is not property of the state. That speech matters. That conscience matters. That work can build a life. That you can criticize your leaders and still love your country. That a future can be chosen, not assigned. The Cold War demanded patience, and Americans, generation after generation, carried the burden of that patience. It meant alliances that had to hold. It meant deterrence that could not fail. It meant standing firm when fear was the background noise of daily life. And yes, it meant moral clarity, refusing to pretend that a system built on secret police and censorship was simply another way. That clarity was mocked at times. It was criticized as too bold, too stubborn, too confident. But history has a way of humiliating cynicism. History rewards the people who refuse to give up on the principles that make life worth living. By the late 1980s, East Germany was cracking from the inside. The leadership was aging, rigid, and out of touch. The economy struggled to keep up, trapped in inefficiency and debt, trying to maintain the appearance of stability, while the reality underneath was decay. The Stasi could watch faces, record conversations, and build files on ordinary lives, but it could not manufacture belief. It could not create a future people wanted. And once a regime cannot offer a future, it begins to rely on fear alone. But fear is not infinite. It wears down. People learn to live around it. They whisper, then they joke, then they protest. And eventually, when enough people stop believing the threats, the entire machine starts to wobble. Then, in 1989, a chain reaction began, one that no committee meeting could truly control. In April, Hungary started dismantling the electrified fence along its border with Austria. On paper, it sounded technical. In reality, it was a crack in the Iron Curtain. And when the curtain tears, people run for daylight. East German refugees began pouring into Hungary through Czechoslovakia or flooding West German embassies, especially in Prague, crowding stairways, sleeping on floors, holding on to one desperate hope: escape. At first, travel was tolerated because of long-standing arrangements, but the flow grew so large it became a crisis for multiple countries. The communist system was being challenged by something it could never fully defeat: mass human movement. When people start leaving in waves, propaganda collapses. A government can lie to the world for a while. It cannot lie to its own citizens when the exits are filling with families. Inside East Germany, the leadership panicked in the way weak regimes always panic. It tried to manage reality with paperwork. It tried to make small changes that looked like reforms without actually surrendering control. On October 18th, longtime hardliner Erich Honecker was pushed aside, replaced by Egon Krenz. The regime hoped a new face might calm the streets, but the streets had moved beyond faces. The streets wanted freedom. Krenz promised reforms, but the public saw it as continuity, more of the same system that had trapped them for decades. Protests didn't fade, they grew. In early November, the government reopened the border with Czechoslovakia after sealing it to stop escapes, only proving it was reacting, not leading. On November 4th, a massive demonstration filled Alexanderplatz, one of the largest in East German history. Voices demanding rights, transparency, genuine change. And when the Interior Ministry published a draft of new travel regulations on November 6th, it enraged ordinary citizens because it offered cosmetic adjustments while still keeping the process opaque and uncertain. People weren't asking for a kinder cage. They were demanding the end of the cage. By November 7th, resignations hit the top levels of power. The regime was shedding pieces to survive. Behind closed doors, officials drafted new travel rules. The intention was to relieve pressure without surrendering authority. East Germans could apply to travel abroad without some of the old requirements, and refugees could leave directly through border crossings. Yes, including crossings in Berlin. But the government still believed it could control timing and messaging. The plan, as written, was for the new rules to take effect the next day. That mattered because one more night of control was one more night of the illusion that the state still decided what freedom looked like. And then history turned on a moment that no one could take back. A press conference. On November 9th, at 6 p.m. Central European Time, Günter Schabowski, an East German party spokesman, sat in front of cameras for a live broadcast. He had not been fully briefed. He had a note in his hand, but not the weight of what it meant. In a dictatorship, information is power, and power must be managed. But Schabowski wasn't managing it. He was stumbling through it. Reporters pressed him about the new travel regulations and whether previous drafts had been a mistake. Schabowski gave a confused explanation, then remembered the note, then began reading it aloud. The note described new rules allowing East Germans to request permission to travel and allowing departures through various border points, including between East and West Berlin. It was dramatic enough. But then came the question that turned policy into a revolution. When does it take effect? Schabowski hesitated, and in that hesitation, you could almost hear the old world holding its breath. Then he said the word that cracked the regime's last grip on the moment. As far as he knew, it took effect immediately, without delay. Immediately. That word moved faster than any military unit ever could. It surged through television signals, radio waves, West German broadcasts that East Germans had been watching for decades. A West German news agency bulletin went out at 7:04 p.m. Major news programs carried the announcement, and East Germans heard it not as a rumor, not as an interpretation, but as a promise spoken on live television. The borders are open now. In a free country, that might be a headline. In a dictatorship, it is an earthquake. Because once people believe the gates are open, you can't close their minds again. The regime's survival depended on control of travel, of information, of fear. But that night, the regime lost control of the one thing it could never afford to lose, the public narrative. People began moving towards the wall, not as a mob, but as a tide. Families, workers, students, older citizens who had lived half their lives in a cage. They gathered at the checkpoints between East and West Berlin, demanding passage. Guards were stunned. Officers were overwhelmed. Phones rang as border forces called superiors, begging for instructions. At first, orders came down to identify aggressive individuals and stamp passports in a way that effectively revoked citizenship, letting people out but trying to punish them for it. That tells you everything about the old system. Even in collapse, it still wanted to punish freedom. But the crowd didn't shrink. It grew. Thousands became tens of thousands. And then something happened that authoritarian regimes dread more than protest signs. The fear advantage began to vanish. Soldiers had rifles, yes, but the people had numbers and the world had cameras. And inside the leadership, no one wanted to own the responsibility of ordering lethal force on live television against civilians whose only crime was believing what the government had just announced. A regime built on intimidation suddenly found itself intimidated by consequences, by exposure, by history. And this is a rule as old as power itself. When a dictatorship hesitates in the spotlight, it begins to unravel. At the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, the pressure peaked. The checkpoint commander, Harald Jäger, faced chaos. He had no clear orders. He had a swelling crowd pressed against barriers. He had a situation that could become a deadly stampede, and sometime around 10:45 p.m., he yielded. The barriers opened. People crossed with little or no verification. The impossible happened, not because a committee authorized it, but because reality had overwhelmed the system. East Berliners poured through as if the world might change its mind. Some ran, some cried, some stood frozen, stunned by the simple miracle of moving forward. On the other side, West Berliners greeted them with flowers, champagne, cheers, and tears. Families reunited, strangers hugged like relatives, and in that moment the wall still stood physically, but it no longer mattered because its power had been broken. Then the images became historic. People climbing onto the wall, standing on top of the very structure built to keep them small, waving and laughing and crying in disbelief. Hammers appeared, chisels, bare hands. Concrete began to crack. Every chip of stone was a piece of fear being removed from the world. The wall, once a symbol of permanence, became a symbol of humiliation for the system that built it. And what makes this night unforgettable is not only what happened, but what didn't happen. There was no invasion. There was no mass firefight. The communist system didn't fall because it was conquered by foreign troops that night. It fell because it was rejected by its own people in front of the world. Now, this is where the American resolve's lens matters, because the fall of the Berlin Wall did not occur in a vacuum. The press conference might have been the spark, but the fire had been building for years, decades, under the weight of communism's failures and the free world's endurance. And at the center of that endurance was the United States. Not because America controlled those gates in Berlin, but because America helped create the conditions in which that wall could no longer stand. The United States held alliances together. It maintained deterrence. It made sacrifices that were unpopular in the moment, but vital in the long run. It defended the idea that liberty was not a regional preference. It was a universal right. And while dictatorships tried to prove they could shape the future through force, the United States and the free world proved something stronger, that open societies out-innovate, out-produce, and outlast closed ones. For older Americans especially, those who grew up under the constant shadow of Cold War tension, this night felt like vindication, because for decades the struggle had been exhausting. It had been expensive. It had felt endless. It was the persistent background worry that history could ignite, and then suddenly the world saw the truth in one night. The communist model could not even keep its own citizens loyal. The system didn't lose because it was misunderstood. It lost because it failed, economically, morally, spiritually. A society built on censorship cannot compete with one built on truth. A society built on surveillance cannot compete with one built on trust. A society built on fear cannot compete with one built on opportunity. And when that contest reached its breaking point, it wasn't the free world that needed walls. History accelerated after that night. 3 weeks later, at the Malta summit, the end of the Cold War was declared. Think about that. After decades of tension, it ended not with a nuclear exchange and not with a grand surrender ceremony, but with the world acknowledging what the wall had already confessed. The Iron Curtain was lifting. The internal German border fell soon after, and in October 1990, Germany reunified. A country cut in half became whole again. A people divided by ideology became citizens of one nation. The speed of it still feels unreal, but this is what happens when a false system loses its ability to intimidate. Collapse can be sudden. It can look like an accident. It can begin with a bureaucratic mistake. But the deeper truth is that it wasn't really an accident at all. The wall fell because the ground beneath it, fear, propaganda, obedience, had been eroding for years. And here is the message that should hit an American viewer in the chest. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a victory not only of Germans over a border, but of the free world's idea over the authoritarian idea. It was proof that moral confidence matters, that endurance matters, that alliances matter, that patience is a weapon, and that a nation willing to defend liberty steadily, consistently for decades can shape the course of history even when it doesn't feel dramatic day to day. The United States didn't need to march into Berlin to defeat the system that built the wall. That system defeated itself because it could not offer a life worth staying for. And America's role, often unseen, often criticized, often underappreciated, was to remain the steady alternative, the unignorable example, the defender of the broader free world when the future looked uncertain. That is why November 9th, 1989 is not merely a German anniversary. It is a free world anniversary. It is proof that the permanent can break. It is a warning to every regime that believes control is destiny. Walls can delay history, but they cannot cancel it. Censorship can confuse people for a time, but it cannot erase reality. You can silence 1,000 voices, but you cannot silence an entire population. Once it decides, it is done living on its knees. And if you want the ultimate symbol of why freedom always has the final word, it's this. The Berlin Wall fell, not when someone strong attacked it, but when ordinary people simply showed up and demanded the right to choose. And for the American Resolves audience, the story becomes personal here, because it reminds us what resolve really means. Resolve is not only bravery in a moment, it is courage across time. Resolve is holding the line when the victory is not guaranteed, when the headlines are not flattering, when the world tells you to soften your principles for the sake of comfort. Resolve is refusing to accept that tyranny is normal, or that people should adapt to cages. Resolve is believing that the future belongs to free people, not controlled subjects. And on the night the Berlin Wall opened, the world saw what happens when that resolve outlasts concrete. Because that night, the world didn't witness a wall falling. It witnessed fear losing. And once fear loses, everything changes.